I came about branding and persuasion and all those things in a way that's probably the way most of you did. I grew up in a religious cult. This wasn't the precursor to that. This was in Oklahoma where we lived, and it was a handling, poison drinking Pentecostal church. Drink a little strychnine, let some snakes go. Praise the Lord. It was fun. So, but my mom decided that wasn't rigorous enough. So she decided to start following this person who they believed was an end-time prophet named William Branham. They believed he was a literal resurrection of the prophet Elijah from the Bible. This particular picture, in fact, was one of the things that they really used to reinforce his story and the idea that this was real. They said this thing over his head was a lick of fire, that it only showed up occasionally in photos, but it was an angel that had given him this message. Turns out it was actually just a reflection of a light in the Ed Sullivan Theater. But it took them until recently to actually prove that and demonstrate, in fact, it was real. So this thing would show up at times, and people have all had these experiences of seeing this. They'll see ministers in the church speak about it, and they think it's real. We came here to Idaho when I was about 6 or 7 years old to open up the first church here in Idaho of this group, and we stopped at the park in Caldwell, Idaho, and if anybody knows where this is at, this was one of the last, in fact, I think this was the last, on the freeway there, the last stoplight on a freeway on I-84 that they took down and finally made it so that you could just drive through. And this is where we lived for the first 3 months I was here, not in the trailers or anything, but literally under that tree right there is where we lived in a tent. And we lived in that tent and were looking for places to live and to be able to create this church. Now, this church had a very interesting sort of belief set. It believed in no education past 6th or 7th grade. It believed that there was that women had to be their husbands or corporal punishment was allowed. They believed that you couldn't listen to music, that you couldn't go to movies, that you couldn't marry outside the organization, that you were supposed to stay cloistered and inside the organization. So this was my very earliest upbringing. And during that upbringing, I started, I at some point was really bought in. I would walk around town as a little 7-year-old boy in Caldwell and Boise. And interestingly enough, the other day, downtown, and some of the people from the church, which still exists here in Boise, and there's hundreds of them. There's about 3 million people in the world today. They were that believed this. They were down here by the post office in downtown Boise, and they were preaching. And I heard it, and I thought to myself, "Wow, that sounds really funny. That sounds like, what I grew up with." And I happened to look really closely, and it was one of the guys who was one of my best friends growing up, who was standing on the corner preaching, had a bunch of people around him. They were doing this. But this is where I grew up, and this is, this was my orientation. As I thought about this, I was thinking back and thinking, this is where I really learned this foundational way of talking to people and gaining people's trust. So when I was 7 years old, I would walk up to people on the street, maybe somebody like you, and I would say, "Wow, you look like such a sweet person. You're beautifully put together. You seem nice and kind. You're beautiful and sweet. I only have..." And so you're going to hell, Jezebel, with your whorish pants, your men's boots, wearing clothes that look like a man, cut your hair, have on makeup. And that was my first sort of introduction in interacting with people in a persuasive way. Now, what was really cool about that is one of two things happened. By the way, I think you're perfectly delightful. I doubt any of those things are true about you. In fact, I'm certain they're not. But one of two things would happen. Now, I'm old enough that this was a time, and this is Idaho too, by the way, so I was old enough at a time, one of two things would happen. I would walk up, and the first thing would happen, if the woman was probably 35, 40 years or older, then the most typical thing that would happen is she would slap me across my face and ask me where I thought I got off saying something like that to her. It was totally inappropriate, which was great because she got to meet my mom. And Mom was a closer. She knew how to get the job done. She knew how to make people start believing this thing. The other thing that would happen is people would say, they'd be shocked, and they'd stop in their tracks. They'd go, what did you just say? What are you talking about? Why would you say something like that? And I'd say something. That's what people say. That's what we believe. When they'd say, where are your parents? They got to meet Mom again. So either way, it was a good outcome. But this was my grounding, and this is where we ate here at the Albertsons. Not in the Albertsons, right from behind it. That's where we got all of our vegetables, and that's where we got our week-old donuts and that kind of thing. They would stack them up on Tuesdays outside behind the Albertsons, and that's where we go and get our food. And I literally, the first year we were here, that's how we ate. And this was our church. And Dan Puga, who's here, grew up right across the street from this church. And it probably looks like the church that most of you guys go to. I'm imagining if you go to church, this is probably something similar to what most of you experience on a daily basis when you're there. But this was our church, and we got this church for a couple of reasons. Number one, the people who were sort of interested in the organization said, well, we have this building, and you can maybe go there. And then they also, if you see on the far right-hand side, there's this little loading ramp that goes down, and that was covered in with a chain link fence when we got there, and there was literally a black bear living there, and it was inside of there. And they said, if you can get rid of the black bear, then you don't have to pay a deposit. It's delicious, but that was my grounding, and it's where I started. By the time I was about 11 or 12 years old, I started to see the cracks in the system. I started to see that we couldn't be the only people that had this right, and that somebody had the one direct version of all the truth in the universe was this person. So I began to ask questions, and as I asked more questions, I became more controversial. I refused to leave school, and that became a big challenge for my. And so when I refused to leave school, they started putting more and more pressure on my family and saying that, if we can't control him, we'll control your family. They can control, but the family couldn't ultimately either. I realized I had to make a decision. 16 years old, I packed up everything that I had in a 1970 Ford Falcon that I'd bought from the Forest Service at a Forest Service auction, and it filled up the whole half back seat of the car, and I took off, and that was it. But before I left, I had to stop at the church one more time, and they laid their hands on me, and they prayed to God that he would turn my soul over to Satan for the destruction of my flesh, that I would be killed for my transgressions, and then I was sent on my way. I wasn't allowed to speak to my family anymore, allowed to speak to me, and for the next number of years, that's exactly. I went on an interesting path, but the path that I started with, the one thing that they'd never said that you couldn't do was go to the library. So from the time I was very young, the library had sort of become this place of refuge for me. It had, as far as I could tell, all of the knowledge of the world in the library. Anything I wanted to know, I could check out a book. As soon as you learned the Dewey Decimal System, you could find right where they were at, and you could read anything that you wanted. And it really expanded my horizons. So my first stop after I left the church was the Carnegie Library in Caldwell, Idaho. I stopped there, and I went inside, and I started sitting down, and I started reading about the heuristics of decision-making, the psychology of belief, about persuasion, about influence, about psychology, about marketing and advertising. And as I began studying that, I realized that I was onto something here, because I had to understand why my mom made this crazy decision that she made to her brothers in this organization. It's completely destructive to her and completely destructive to us. And that study's continued now for the better part of 35 years. And during that time, I've learned a few things about why we do the things we do. I learned a few things about why my mom made the decisions that she made. And I've learned how that applies in business, most importantly. And that's what I want to share with you a little bit about today. Because I realized as I walked out of that church, I had two choices. And this is the two choices that each and every one of us make every single day when we get up. When we get up in the morning, we stand in the mirror and we make a decision. Or while we're still laying in bed trying to decide what to do, we make a decision. The first decision is, I get up and I'm gonna advance today. I'm gonna make my decision to grow. I'm going to go out and I'm gonna eke it out one more day. I'm gonna slug it out a little bit harder. I'm gonna do one more thing that will ultimately allow me to grow my business, grow myself, or grow in any way that I want to. I'm going to advance. Or the other decision we make, very simply, is that we decide to die. We decide today I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to take the steps I know I need to take. I'm not going to do the things that I know I need to do. I know I should get these things done, but I'm not going to. And every time we do that, we die a little bit, and our competition advances. So it's a constant decision every single day, advance or die. The interesting thing that happens is we've just gone through a pretty dramatic phase of advance or die over the last few years. So during the downturn of the economy, we saw a lot of businesses fail. We saw the biggest institutions in the United States be rocked. And then we also saw a lot of companies start. We saw people grow up. We saw a whole generation be fundamentally impacted by this. But what happened, interestingly, is that customers changed. And customers changed in an interesting way. They took all of this information in, and if you look at probably the closest similarity we have, it would be during the 1930s in the United States during the Depression. We had this terrible economic cycle that lasted a very long period of time, and that people finally came out, but it had long-term impact that still affects us today. Most of us in this room probably have grandparents or great-grandparents who lived through the Depression, and their mentality and their thought process has continued forward for many, many years. The next big thing that happened after the Great Depression of the 1930s was World War II, which also had a fundamental impact on how we think. Well, We sort of see that correlation today. We had a major war going, actually two major wars going on, and we had a recession, or what some people have probably properly termed as a depression, whether it was as long as it should be or it could have been or not. And during that period of time, it caused people to change. It caused them to change the way they think. It caused them to change the way they act, and it caused them to change how they buy. So when we look at how they changed, they became more demanding. So when you think about your customers today, they expect more from you. They want more from you, and they demand that you give them more of the kinds of things that they want. So they look around and they say to themselves, in this plethora of choices that I have, how can I get exactly what I want? As we look at commoditization of products, as we look at consolidation of industries, they get more and more demanding. The second thing is they become more connected. In the last decade, we're the most connected we've ever been in our life, and certainly year by year by year, that doubles all the time, and we're becoming more and more connected. So now, what used to, it's interesting, I was just reading something, and I don't know that this is absolutely factual, but my understanding is that the processor and the computing power of my phone that I carry around in my pocket is more powerful than the whole of the computers and technology that they use to put man on the moon. So if we look at that and we think about that, and then we think about how we've consolidated our ability to communicate. When I walk into your store, I can know everything about you. I can know everything about your business. I can know who thinks you're great, what they think is poor about you, and I can call my 3 closest friends and find out that they've already had an experience with you and find out what that experience is. People have become more educated. We have people who are much more educated today. They have a better college degree than they've ever had. They have more college degrees than they've ever had. They're more educated than they've ever been. And they are more educated because they have more access to information. Again, this connection gives them access to information. So when we take a look at that, we think demanding, connected, educated. But then what's happened also, and this is where the downturn in the economy really started to affect people, as they became more skeptical. They started looking at everyone and they started saying, is this really true? Because why? Why do you think people became more skeptical? Anybody have any ideas? They became more educated, but one of the big things that happened with all this connectivity is a lot of bullshit came out, right? You look on Facebook every day, Twitter, you look any place and people go at this and they go, oh wow, that's nonsense. Like I incorrectly looked at my phone the other day and it was on a site that I trusted, MSNBC, and it said Macaulay Culkin had died. I looked at it and I thought, Macaulay Culkin died. And I told somebody that was standing next to me, Macaulay Culkin died. And then like 10 minutes later, I find, because I didn't look any further, I just looked at that. And I reported it that quickly, but then I find out 10 minutes later, in fact, it's just a hoax. It wasn't really true. But the problem with it is we find out so many of these things are true, but we're also able to see propaganda, and we're also able to see persuasion and influence happen at a very fast pace and see it unfold at a very fast pace. So as we see people spinning something, we see somebody else unspinning it at the same time. And in the middle someplace is the truth. So we become very skeptical. We've also become more minimalistic. If we take a look at that idea of minimalism, we're looking at what is the least possible effort to get the maximum result, and what is the smallest amount that I can do something with to get the maximum happiness. So when we take a look at what has happened over the years, and particularly what happened after the Depression, after World War II, we saw an expansion here, but what's happening is a population is aging. So the population with the most money and the most access in our society today, the boomers, and then Generation X, and now coming in Generation Y, those are the people that control most of the business, control most of the politics, and control most of the money in the United States today. They're aging, and as they're aging, they're starting to shrink down, but they have most of the money. So we're looking at that, and we're saying they're looking around. So what are some of the things that we see around this idea of minimalism? We start to see more industrial-looking homes. We start to see this focus on things like tiny houses, for example, where people are saying, I'd rather live in a 400 or 500, 600-foot space than I would live in a 2,000, 5,000-foot room. Or they're also saying, I think that the important thing to me is experience. I want to have experiences. I don't necessarily need all of these things around me. I want to be freer to be out and go and do all the things I wasn't able to do before. I now have access and I have money and I know what's available and I can do that, or I can sit here and I can spend more time in my home, I can build a bigger house, I can put all of my money into that, and that's not what they're choosing. So people are choosing a much more active but minimal lifestyle, become more frugal. Because as we've seen industries consolidate and as we've watched all of these different markets adjust to these changes, what's happened is as consolidation happens, prices go down because everything becomes commoditized. So everybody has an idea of how much something would cost. So how many people here have ever looked at something and you still have this idea in your mind that it should cost X. So you go to the store and you say, well, a couch should only cost $500. Or you say a bed should only cost $1,000 or whatever it is. You go there and you've got this sort of price fixed in your mind. Well, that time that you had this price fixed, combine that with the idea that prices are coming down in most categories, margins are getting thinner, and people say, yeah, why would I ever buy a premium brand? Why would I ever spend this much more money for something? And then when you start looking at on the back end, because of this education, this access to information, you look on the back end and people have access to finding out that you use child labor in India to make your clothes, or that you are buying products that are produced in a place that's polluting the environment. You add all these things together and people become more frugal, and they say, if I'm going to spend my money, I'm going to spend it on the best product I can with the smallest price that most closely fits my lifestyle. If I can't, I'll pass. And when you combine that with minimalism, people saying I need less and I'm going to live with less because I want more experience, ultimately people think about how they buy things differently, and they think about your brands differently. They've all been very easily distracted. Because of all this access to information, people have become very, very easily distracted. And with that ease of distraction, the problem with it is that we have this idea that all information is available to us all the time, and it really is. You pick up your phone and you can get any information you want about anything that you want. And they suffer from attentional bias, a tendency of emotionally salient stimuli in an environment to draw your attention preferentially. So when you think about that, and you think about what are the things that currently draw people's attention constantly? Who has an idea of what that is? On a daily basis, what are the things that pull your attention away? Facebook, Twitter, yeah, those are the two obvious things, right? I mean, those are the first things that come to most people's mind, but it's also things like email. It's also things like, you know, the access that you have to things like food. I mean, you think about it, if you think about, if anybody in this room is between 40 and 50 years old, if you think about the access to food that you had before, most people still went to the store once a week, probably, or sometimes once a month. There was less drive-through restaurants than there are today. Most of the things that we did were very intentional decisions, but so we have all these different things to do. Oh, do I want McDonald's today, or do I want KFC, or do I want a healthy meal? What am I going to choose? And you've got, within a block, 4 or 5, 6 different choices. So you have all this emotional stimuli that's there all the time competing. Well, guess what happens? That same emotional stimuli exists no matter what your business is. There's always 10 or 12 or 14 other choices and people who are constantly bombarding you with those messages. So whatever that stimulus is, those customers are easily distracted. When you're trying to send a message, when you're trying to brand, you have to be able to focus attention. Because if you can't focus attention, people won't know what to do. The other thing that happened is they suffer from decision fatigue. Decision fatigue is one of these things that nobody really thinks about. And as we talk about persuasion, as we think about influence, when we think about the things that people are trying to do on a daily basis, if you think of on a scale of 1 to 100, 1 being, or 0 to 100 even, but 1 being the first decision you make in a day, and the last decision you make in a day is being 100. If you have to get up and you haven't chosen what clothes to wear, you don't know what you're going to have for breakfast, if you haven't decided which way you're going to go to work or which car you're going to take to work, you've already now had to start making this series of decisions. And what happens as you make decisions is that you become poorer and poorer at making decisions throughout the day. We think we get better and better because now we're awake and we're doing all these things, but in reality what happens is we get poorer and poorer and poorer until something happens, a big event occurs. And so the big event that usually occurs is lunch. So people go up and their decision making wanes, and then they have lunch, and then their decision-making capacity goes up for a period of time after lunch. And then it starts to go down again, because decision requires the use of glucose in your brain. Your brain making decisions burns up the amount of glucose that you have. So when your brain is suffering from a lack of glucose, what happens is people tend to go with the safest decisions, or the decisions that are the ones that are most known to them, as opposed to actually looking at decisions cognitively and actually rationalizing and making good decisions. So the seminal study on this was done in Israel, and it looked at judges. And so as judges throughout the day, if you went in in the morning and you were one of the first people with the same crime, let's just say fraud, and you had a 30-year sentence, and you had several of those people that were similar kinds of crimes, if you went in the morning and you were one of the first people, you were about 60% more likely to get parole than if you went right before lunch. And then it dropped back down again right after lunch, because what happened is during that time when your brain's depleted glucose till the time that you actually replete it again, is that in that period people say they start to make decisions more slowly, and they pick the safe choice. They pick what's known to them. So should I give that person? I've already given a few people that. I better protect society best by doing this other thing, as opposed to actually looking at all the facts and all the details. So they make the safer choice, or what to be the smart choice. And then they use this idea of decision heuristics. So a heuristic is simply an idea that we have a process for doing things, and we use this process over and over and over again. Decisions are no different. And so people tend to choose what they recognize, right? People tend to choose what they recognize. So if they have to choose between Coke and Pepsi, something interesting happens. So this is a very recent study that was done, and it's a neuropsychological study that was done. And they put people in a functional magnetic resonating imaging machine, which takes pictures of your brain and sees which part of your brain is lighting up and activating when you choose a brand. So without telling people what they were tasting, only they were going to do a blind cola taste test, they started checking their brains, and they did their blind cola taste test. When they tasted it, overwhelmingly people chose Pepsi over Coke. Overwhelmingly. And if you looked at the areas of their brains that lit up, it was all of the areas of their brains that you would expect to light up when you made a good decision, when you made a decision about something you liked, and when you were actually processing decision making, and that you concluded that you felt good about your decision. Then they went back and they had people come into this process, and they told them, you're going to taste Coke and you're going to taste Pepsi. This is Pepsi, this is Coke. What happened overwhelmingly was that Pepsi dropped to the bottom and Coke popped way up to the top. And all of the areas of the brain, the reward centers, everything else lit up like crazy. Even though everybody in all the studies before, when they didn't know, chose Pepsi heavily, when as soon as they heard about Coke, that this was Coke, they made a decision. And their brain reflected their decision and their beliefs. And so the interesting part about this is what people believe is actually what they do. So one of the things we say oftentimes in persuasion, we say in psychology a lot, is that people's behaviors are their beliefs. And when we look at this, this is actually true at a biological level. People's behaviors are their beliefs. So they drink Coke, and they have all these experiences with Coke, and they know what Coke stands for in that brand. The brain lights up and says this is the clear and obvious choice. So there's a lot of these heuristics that we use on a daily basis to make decisions. The first one I want to talk about is a pricing heuristic. So if you have to make a decision on a bottle of wine, how many people, anybody here a wine expert? Anybody here like really, really knowledgeable? Okay, so you're at a business meeting, and you're sitting there, and you have 4 bottles of wine to choose from. One is $50, one is $45, one is $30, and one is $17. And you have to make a decision about a good wine. This is an important decision, an important business meeting. Which one do you choose? Well, if you don't know it, right. If you don't know them, then which one do you choose? Right. Most people go, well, it's got to be better, it's more expensive. That would, and it's not even necessarily, this is, the $2 chuck that they sold at I can't think of the name, what is it? Yeah, Trader Joe's, thank you. So the $2 chuck they sold at Trader Joe's, when tested with most people, tested pretty well compared to up to about a $20 bottle of wine. So people didn't really know the difference. So people, and in lack of other information, they make a decision using the heuristic that they know expensive is better, right? The more expensive it is, the better it is. The second thing they have is the availability heuristic, and this availability heuristic is very, very important when you think about your business now. The availability heuristic says that people tend to go with the most easily accessible information that they have and the most readily accessible. So if people look very quickly on Yelp and see the first 3 reviews of this restaurant is no good, or if they look at complaints.com and yours is the first complaint on there, they're probably going to say, you know what, they're going to generalize, that business is no good, I'm not going to do anything about it. Oh, they don't have a website, that website looks like it was built in 1980, no good, they move on. Availability is just another way of people saying very quickly, I'm going to make a decision based on the information I have right in front of me, I'm going to make this decision very quickly. Anchoring heuristic, this is another interesting sort of thing. So the anchoring heuristic says this, a couple of different things about it. When it comes to pricing or when it comes to decision making, that people make decisions based on things they've heard first. So when people are given an opportunity to walk into a wine store and German music is playing, guess what wine they buy more? German wine, right? They don't even know why, but it anchored it in there, and then they see German wine, and something in their head clicks, and they go, oh, German music, German wine, I should buy German wine. Change it to French music, and French wine sales go up dramatically by no comparison. And so when you look at this anchoring heuristic, what it seems like it wouldn't make sense, right? That, I could think this one through. So they said, let's go test this. So all they had people do was simply write down the last 2 digits of their social security number on a piece of paper, fold it up, and hand it in. And then they asked them how much would they pay for a bottle of wine. The people whose social security numbers ended in high numbers, above 60 or 70, paid on average 20%, said the bottle of wine was worth about 20% more than the people whose numbers were in the lows, 10s, or 20s. So as you look at that, people are influenced just by the information that they get and that they have around them at any given time, and it's preferentially taken without people even thinking about it. So then when we look at things like, where does the best wine come from? If your preferences, or if you've heard before, or even if it appears that this wine is from France, because France has such a great brand reputation of being great wine, if you have to choose between that and 2 Buck Chuck, you're going to choose the French wine every time. And if you have to choose between someone you don't know or someone you've heard of, you'll choose that every time. Now, is there any real difference between Nike's clothes, Polo's clothes, or Walmart's clothes? When you come down to very basics, probably not that much different. But each one of them means something different to you. Each one of them have a story that they're trying to tell. So buyers need 3 things from you, and they need 3 things from your brand. And this is the important thing to keep in mind. First, they need a story that they can tell and that they can take part in. People are looking for a story that they can understand right away. Stories are our oldest form of communication. They're the way that we have transferred knowledge and the way that we've transferred growth and education and everything through through civilization. So when we think about it, the oldest sort of things that we have to look back at are cave drawings, petroglyphs, things like that. And they're not just a petroglyph of a random buffalo that somebody decided to draw today. What they really are is that they are stories that people are trying to tell. They talk about the great hunt, the change of season, this massive thing that occurred. And they're trying to tell these stories, and then we pass those on. If you look at the Egyptian pyramids, it's the same way. And as we look back over time, as we find more and more texts and different things through archaeology, we see that people are telling these stories. They're the basis of the most fundamental pieces of our society. They are the fabric of our society, whether in our society globally. So it's our myths, our legends, it's religion, it's politics, it's all the things that we believe. How many people here have this in your pocket? You have some of this in your pocket right now. What is this? Cash, money, right? It's worth something, isn't it? Why? Because we believe it is, right? We've told a story that this is actually worth something. And at one point, it was actually worth gold or silver. Now, it's not worth that anymore, but we still tell the same story. And we say, well, that's worth X. And I can get X number of goods with that thing. But it's not really real. We could have just as easily agreed that it was shells. We could have as easily, which we've done in the past. We could agree that it was blankets. We could agree whatever we agree. That is a transfer of value. And we're starting to see that shift today. Where do we see that shift happening today? Bitcoin. A perfect example. Nobody knew what Bitcoin was 2 or 3 years ago, but today we've seen this story shift to this is a more secure and a safer way of containing your money, and it's more transportable, and it's more universal. And all of these kinds of, as we think about that, story that we already knew about cash shifted to a story that we didn't understand, but that we could understand for a very important reason. We'll talk about that. So the important thing you have to do with your brand is tell powerful stories about who you are and where you came from. Why do you think I start all of my talks with that story of how I grew up? It's a fundamental piece of my brand. If I show up and I tell a different story, people are confused. They don't know who I am. They don't know if I'm that same guy or not. They don't know if what they came to hear was going to be there or not. So if I wait and tell my story at the end, a lot of people are going to be really disappointed if they've read my books or they've heard of me, but they haven't heard me speak yet. If they don't hear that story right off the bat, that's what they're waiting for. Like, I really want to know what that was like growing up in a cult. So if I don't on that experience right away, they don't get what they're looking for and they fail. I'm going to tell you a story about green lizards. This is a very interesting story. Alabama. Vance Vanders was a guy who was walking through a graveyard and in Selma, Alabama. While he was walking through the graveyard, he ran into a witch doctor. The witch doctor touched him, and he got incredibly sick. And stomach that caused him to be bedridden. The doctors couldn't find a cause for it. He was absolutely sick and bedridden. And Dr. Drayton Doherty was called, and he examined the man, and he said, he'd never seen anything like it. Nothing like this before. But Vance Vander's wife said, well, it's because he's been hexed. He was hexed by this witch doctor. So Dr. Doherty goes and he says, let me think about that. I want to really study it. He goes, that's a possibility. So he comes back about 2 days later and he said, I have the cure. He said, I went to the graveyard where you're at. I took my pistol with me and I found the witch doctor. I put my gun to his head and told him if he didn't tell me how to cure you, that I would kill him. And he gave me the cure. What happened is when he touched you, he implanted a small egg inside of you. That egg grew into a lizard and it's eating you from the inside out, but he gave me exactly what I need to do. So you're going to take this injection, this tincture, and when it works, you'll know. So he gave him an injection of an emetic. An emetic is something that makes you throw up violently. So he gives him the injection. It's like syrup of Ipecac or something like that if you've ever seen that. So he gives it to him. A couple minutes later, he starts throwing up violently throwing up. While he's throwing up and everybody's going, oh my God, waiting to see what's going to happen, Dr. Doherty reaches into his bag and pulls out a green lizard and sets it on the bed, and the lizard scrambles up the bed. Everybody sees it and goes, oh my God, he's saved. And then guess what happens the next morning? Vance Vanders wakes up, has a healthy bacon and egg breakfast, goes to work, and is healed miraculously. But he believed this story so powerfully that this could actually happen, that a witch doctor touching you could have some effect, that these things could happen. And as a result, he actually experienced this physical malady that stuck with him for 6 months until somebody told a story that matched his belief and helped him move it forward. So these stories that we tell are very powerful, and that's why our brands are so important. Because the stories that we tell over and over again that match people's worldview are the things that cause them to make the decisions they make. And when faced with a lot of information and faced with many, many choices, they choose the thing that's most comfortable. They go through this heuristics process we were talking about. They choose the thing that is most comfortable, that's most widely available to them, or most readily available to them. So the story selling process, this is how you do it. It's actually based on the oldest myths that exist in our society today. Brands are built around this idea that Joseph Campbell came up. Joseph Campbell was our foremost mythologist in the 20th century. He was the person who went around the world and studied all of the myths that made up all of the fabric of society for each culture that he went to. And he came up with the monomyth, this idea that the same myth that helped every culture get from place A to place B was the same. It looked slightly different, it sounded slightly different with different characters and names, but it was the same. And the ordinary world, right? This is what things are today. This is how it is. And then there's the calling, right? The calling was, I realized something's missing. And if you think about this in a couple of terms, you can think about this as we go through this in a couple of movies you've probably seen. You've probably seen Fight Club, or you've seen Star Wars. Star Wars was built specifically around this movie. If you've seen The Matrix, another one that was built specifically around the monomyth. So the ordinary world. So in The Matrix, what was the ordinary world? Does anybody remember? Anybody seen that movie? He was at his job, right? And he hated his job. He came drudging into work, and he sat down at his desk, and then something happens. He realizes, this sucks, my life sucks, but then something happens. He literally gets a phone call, right? And then there's a threshold. He comes to this place where he has to make a decision, the red pill or the blue pill. He's standing on a ledge, right? And then there's an initiation. He makes a decision and he jumps. And then he goes, and he's now in this place where he's initiated by people who know more than him, right? They give him this information. And then he reaches this point, the abyss, where he thinks, oh my God, this is crazy. I can't get here. I don't know what to do, but he has this moment of reckoning with himself. And then he's transformed in that moment. Like he comes out the other side, and we see him standing in there, and everything's happening to him at once. He has access to all the knowledge and everything that he needs. And finally, there's the return. He comes back with the elixir of the truth. This is also the path for a brand. And so if we look at it, the ordinary world, what is the ordinary world that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis when they're thinking about the products or services you sell? What is that ordinary world they live in, and why are they complacent? What is expected to them? What are the things that cause them to say, any brand will do? What's missing? We're looking for that missing piece. What is the thing that's missing for them? What's the one thing that if they had that would change the world for them? Right? It's always something fairly simple, it seems like, when it comes to brands, when it comes to businesses. People are just looking for that one or two little things that totally revolutionizes the world for them. Then it's the threshold. Do I make this decision or not? What would help me make this decision? Oftentimes that's testimonials. It's support from people who are also idea or thought leaders that can say, yes, this is a good decision. I'm doing it too. The initiation, they find a mentor, they find somebody who's already using it, and they can go and they can ask Todd to explain to them how, for example, a building is built and why this structure is better than another. Or the abyss, and the abyss is usually when they're saying, do I spend this much money or do I spend that much money? And they're trying to weigh a decision. Should I spend more? Should I spend less? Which one of these things resonate with me better? Finally, they make a decision because they've had enough information, they've had enough emotional experiences, and they've had this idea that they're going to make the decision. They do it, leads them to clear conclusions to spend the money. And then the final thing that happens is they come back with the elixir. They become the brand ambassador. So if you think about conversions like this that happen, I'll tell you how it happened for me. It happened for me from PC to Apple. I went from a PC to a Mac, but it took me 20 years to go from a PC to a Mac. I kept having these little moments where I would look at it and I would think, and I'd get right up to this point. I'd get right up, I would know it was missing. I would be so frustrated with my PC. I didn't like what it was doing, that I couldn't do things other people were doing. I'd get to the threshold and I'd be about ready to make the decision, and then I would just back away from it. And finally, I was forced into a place where I said, okay, I'm just going to try this. I'm going to try it a little bit. And I played around with it. And then I got there and I was like, gosh, I don't know. And I remember having this very distinct discussion in an EO forum about whether I should switch all my stuff over to a Mac or whether I should PC. So I had this whole presentation built around this. What should I do? Because I knew some people use Macs, some people use PCs. And I had this moment. And I was at the abyss saying, okay, all's lost. It's crazy. I'm never going to have the best of both worlds. But then somebody who came along and said, let me show you. And they took my hand right at that moment when I was at this crisis where I was going to go to the beginning and do anything. And they said, let me help you move forward. Here's why. They made it very simple for me. They made it safe for me. I made the decision and I moved forward. And transformation happened immediately. Once I made the decision in my mind and I got over that 15 or 20 minute learning hurdle, I was completely sold. And the more I used it, the better it got. And the better my experience came. And the more negative my previous experience came, the more I became an evangelist. I began telling people, you've got to use a Mac. It's so much better. And here's why. Here are the 4 or 5 reasons why. I've become the mentor for a number of people and helped them through that process. But as I think about it, back, this only happened because Apple told such a compelling story. They told this compelling story the whole way using this exact format. Apple's whole brand is built on this format. And that's how your brand should be built as well. People are looking for a real reason to believe. That's the second thing that they're looking for. They're looking for a real reason to believe. They want to know why they should believe you over someone else. Because when you're faced with massive choices, how do you know which one to choose if you don't have enough information? Well, you choose by the first 3 or 4 reviews you can find on your phone, or you choose by what your friends are doing, or you choose by an experience that you had way in the past. But maybe it's not relevant anymore, right? And so we look at this and we say, what's my reason to believe? How do I know what to believe or how to believe? And if your brand can deliver on this idea of this is how you know to believe, then people will make a decision. So about your brand. So what do you think conspiracy theorists and your brand have in common? Anybody have any idea? It's very interesting because what do when we think about conspiracy theorists, what do we think about usually? That they're nuts, that they're these whack jobs that kind of, live in a basement and don't really connect with the rest of the world properly or anything else. But in reality, when you think about the number of people, and we sort of laugh about this, and we talk about, so how many in this room, let's just ask a quick question. How many people here believe that that the World Trade Centers were intentionally blown up by the government? It would take a lot of work to do that, right? I mean, there's so many things that would be involved. If you think about what it would take to systematically set up explosives to blow 2 big buildings down like that and cause a massive destruction, it would take months of work to be able to plan that and then actually implement it. And nobody ever see anybody walking through. Nobody accidentally drops a blasting cap. Nothing ever happens. When we think about that, we think, well, yeah, it's because these people are crazy. And yet 64% of the American population believed that we had noticed that an attack was going to occur and we chose not to take action on it. That's sort of interesting when you think about it, because in this room, nobody's going to raise their hand and say, yeah, I think that the government knew this was going to happen, or the government did it. But we do say, yeah, I think they knew it was going to happen, and they let it happen. When you think about it logically, it makes no sense. But really, what it comes down to then, government says, well, let's make it about country and God and apple pie and all those kinds of things. But in reality, it's really not. It's all about a worldview, and that worldview says you can't trust the people in power. You can't trust them. So anything that anybody in power says is probably not true. Anybody that says counter to it might be true. They have this worldview that the people who are in charge are not truthful and that they're not going to help you. The interesting thing about this idea of conspiracy theory is that people use that very same level of thinking when it comes to brands. That very same level of thinking when it comes to brands. So what is the worldview people have about your product, about your service? What is it that they think generally? Are you a service or a product area that can be trusted? What's a product line that somebody can think of right off the top of your head that has very, very similar worldview to the conspiracy theorists? Can anybody think of something like that? Or people instantly distrust them? Network marketing, great example. What's another one? Used cars, right? Or even new cars, right? People have this whole idea, have this worldview that it's a not trusting situation that's set up against them. It's us versus them, and they can't be trusted. So we have to start out by being something different. And if the car brands that do the best are the ones that seem to take away all of those barriers, right? The ones that say, listen, we have, and the biggest shift we saw was, no haggle pricing. This is the price you pay. You can come in and ask all you want. We're not going to give you anything different. And then people realize that's not really true. They just don't change the price. They just give you a lot more stuff if you ask for it, right? So they're not really negotiating the price, but they're negotiating what you get in the price. But it took people a long time to get there. So no haggle pricing meant sales went up. They loved it because now you took away this piece of worldview that says that people are dishonest, and you switched it over to, we're the honest ones. In this whole thing, we're the ones that are telling the truth. Because you have to exist in the world if you're a conspiracy theorist. So you need somebody who's telling you the truth. You need that central source. And by the way, these millions of conspiracy theorists do have central sources, just like we have central sources. Who are our central sources for making decisions when we're trying to buy products? What's one of the biggest ones you can think of in the world today? What is it? Internet. Right. Consumer reports, another real big one, right? People look at that, or you go to Amazon, you look at a series of reviews. So whether the reviews are bought or not doesn't really matter. What matters is that people look at this and say, well, it must be true. They have 4.8 out of 5 stars. It's got to be true. Or look, Consumer Reports says this is the very best thing. Reason to believe. But they have a worldview that says, well, these are people I can trust. I have a heuristic that allows me to make a decision about what I see on the internet that lets me know which things to trust. I've suddenly become an expert at knowing what is a good site versus a bad site versus a truthful site versus an untruthful site. And yet in reality, we really have no idea at all. So in my own industry in selling books, New York Times bestseller, that's a place that you can go to and say, it's probably a good book if it's on the New York Times bestseller, right? On the bestseller list. If it's on the New York Times bestseller list, it's probably a good book, well written, all of those things. It costs about $60,000 to get on the New York Times bestseller list. If you want to be a New York Times bestselling author, I don't care, you could write drivel and still get on the list. Doesn't matter. But for about 60 grand, you can do it. So we look at that list and we say, in our worldview, this is true, right? These books are good books because they're vetted. They're vetted by Oprah. They're vetted by the New York Times. They've got to be good books. So our worldview says, this is a trusted resource. We can go there and always be safe. And guess what? Most of the books, even if they are drivel, and even if they're no good, you buy them from the New York Times bestseller list, or you buy them from Oprah's book club, you'll find a reason why you suck and the book didn't, right? And that's a challenge. That's a real challenge that people have. So your worldview is their world versus their worldview. You have to look as a brand and say, what is the worldview of the people that I'm working with, and how do I become the trusted resource in that worldview? How do I position myself in a way that people see me as being like them, those people that I want to move? How do I position myself in a way that I can get people to see me as being like them? And get them to like me too. Priming. Priming is an interesting psychological phenomenon. Priming says that if we're presented with an idea, we're much more likely to see associations with it or see it again the next time. So the interesting thing about branding is when we talk about, people will spend all of this money building a big brand, right? They'll build a logo, they'll build a color palette, a brand book, they'll do all of these kinds of things. But the interesting part about it is they never get their message out in a way that's significant because they spent all of their money on creating it. But the reality of it is that if people can't see it, they won't know what to do with it. If they can't understand it, they won't know what to do with it. So you have to get this out. And if they don't see it, when the first time they see it, they're going to look at what did they see before, and they'll say, oh, it's like that. And so if I had 20 different products here that were in a similar category, and you didn't really know what the category was, but I said, oh, it's like this, then which one would you pick? You would pick the one that you knew best, or the one that I thought was best, or that somebody else said might be best. But what you would really be doing is you'd be looking for what else is like this that I already know. So if I demonstrate to you that something is true, if I show you something, you're going to start seeing things that are more like it. And the best example of this of priming is when you buy a car. It affects your reticular activating system in your brain. Your reticular activating system does something very powerful. It helps you separate the expected from the unexpected. Broca's area in your brain does that when you hear things. So the reticular activating system says, when I see this, I'll begin to notice it more. Priming does that. When you buy a car, when you bought a new car, you get in the car and you haven't seen that many of them. You're so smart because you buy them. Right? You get in the car and you drive away, and the first thing you see when you drive down the road is 7 other cars, same color as yours, same make, same model, same year, right? Because now your reticular activating system is looking for these things. And then it goes through the process and saying, is it like this? Is it like that? I wonder if they have the same Sirius stereo system I do. You start doing these kinds of things. But the next time you see a car in the category of SUVs, for example, or in this other category of cars, maybe highly efficient cars, you start looking at it and you say to yourself, is it more like this car that I have currently? Like, is the quality the same? So if you have good quality car that you've already purchased in one category, and then you start looking for a car in another category, you already start looking for all those cars that are like yours, right? The same brand, and the same sort of quality that you imagine that they will have, and that's where you start your search. You never really start your search outside of your brand. Most people here are Ford, Chevy, Dodge people their whole life. They never go outside. It doesn't matter. If they don't buy Chevy trucks and Dodge cars. They go back to what they know. And that's because they're primed. And we do this with our brand on an ongoing basis and tell them what to look for. If we tell people what they should watch for, we can prime people negatively or we can prime them positively. So if we want to talk about our competition, we want to prime them to look for those things that are obviously negative, right? So you may begin to notice when you look at these other brands that they do some things like this, and here's why they might do that. A lot of people disagree. Let me show you a couple of charts here that show exactly how negative that is and why it doesn't work the way they say it does. And then they start looking at all these other people in the category and they go, well, yeah, they all do that. But wait, these guys don't. They're starting to create differentiation, separation. And then you set the criteria for what they should be looking for. So here are the important things you really need to look at. Here's what that really means. And as you set that criteria, what happens is you prime them again to start looking for it. When they believe the criteria and they see the criteria and they have a means in a new industry or in a new purchasing process of looking at something comparatively, and the first person to give them that information or the last person to give them information that they believe, that real reason to believe, is what they're going to compare against everyone else. And they're going to have a really difficult time getting away from that initial set of criteria that they imagined in that company. So you want to sell more, you meet clients at their belief, and you tell them a story that they believe in. So by telling these stories in the way that I showed you earlier, it gives you the opportunity to tell a story that people can take in because they already understand what to do with information. If I tell you, what's the worst thing you can do if I start telling you a story? If I begin telling you a story right now, and I sit down with you and we're talking, and I'm telling you I'm in the middle of my story, what's the worst thing that you can do? Look at your watch, interrupt, right? Those kind of things. Those are the things that we know what to do and we know what not to do. So as soon as we start hearing a story, our brain knows how to process it, which is exactly why you see the switch from Pepsi to Coke when people know what they're drinking. Because they know the story, they know what's expected of them, and they know what their experiences are with Coke. You have all of these imbued experiences that hang on with people for a very long time, and that's why their brains change. Finally, they're looking for an experience that they can't forget. People want an experience. When we talked about how customers change, we talked about how they want more experiences and less things. They also want an experience when they buy their things. They want there to be something about this experience that's memorable and different. So when you go buy a Land Rover, it's different than buying a Toyota, or it's different than buying a Jeep, or it's different than buying any other SUV.